Thank you so much, everyone, for signing up and taking part this evening. We'll just wait for one more minute because we've got so many people this evening. Broken all records, really. Masses and masses of people. So we'll just give everyone time to sign in.
Yeah, lovely hellos coming in.
Yes, hello, Alessandra. Lovely to see you there. So I suppose we should probably start because we've got so much to cover this evening as well. So this is the Academy of Nutritional Medicine with Dr. Sarah Myhill. She's been a frequent guest of ours over the years. We're delighted to have her, very, very grateful to her for taking the time. She's talking this evening about mitochondria, not hypochondria, diagnosing and managing mitochondrial dysfunction in disease. I'll just read a little bit of background on her, even though I know that everybody knows her, so it's not really necessary. Just to mention that we will have time at the end for questions, so please put them in the Q&A or the chat. And for those that we don't have time to answer, we'll save them all, and hopefully we'll have her back again to continue answering them. So Dr. Myhill is an independent medical practitioner specializing in allergy, nutritional, and environmental medicine. She qualified from Middlesex Hospital Medical School in 1981 and worked as an NHS GP before transitioning to independent practice. She has over 40 years of experience and has treated more than 9,000 patients with chronic fatigue syndrome and myalgic encephalomyelitis, focusing on mitochondrial dysfunction as a key factor in these conditions. She's the medical director of the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, clinical director of the College of Naturopathic Medicine, as well as their patron. She's authored multiple award-winning books, with another one coming out very, very soon. And those that are already out include Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, It's Mitochondria, Not Hypochondria. So, Sarah, I'll turn over to you for anything else that you'd like to say about your publications later, maybe, because you've got so many. And we very much look forward to hearing from you. So thank you.
Thank you, Gillian, very much indeed. Now, I'm mindful that many of you have heard me rabbit on about mitochondria before, but we've got some new stuff that hopefully will keep your interest. So let's, I've got a PowerPoint here. I'll send it on to Gillian when we're done, and you're all welcome to have a copy of it. So here it is, I hope. There we go. Okay, so this is what I've been asked to talk about. That's the subject. Those are some of the books that I've written with Craig Robinson, who's a mathematician. So I do the medical bit, and then he tidies it up and makes it sound like some good English. Okay, now, as I get older, I hope my medicine becomes more simple. And I'm mindful that the people that I treat are struggling to pay for their treatments very often, to do them, to fit them into their life. And so I want to make the approach to disease as simple as possible. And the point is, as I say to everybody, life is not a battle, it's a war. It's a war that we're going to fight for life. It's a war that we know we're going to lose. But, if I lose my war aged 102, and at the end, you'll see why I've chosen on that age, then I'll settle for that. So what we have to do is put in place all interventions that are biologically plausible, affordable, and sustainable in such a way that we can integrate that into our normal life. It's no good me saying to somebody, oh, here's a fantastic treatment, but it costs £50,000 and it'll take you 12 hours a day to do it, because it's not going to happen, is it? And we should all be doing these interventions all the time now to prevent disease occurring. And then if you are a therapist, you'll be much better empowered to help your patients, because you will know the nitty gritty of, how to do the darts, the regimes, how much they cost, where to get the stuff from, and so on and so forth. And my view is that there are two major drivers of disease. One is energy delivery mechanisms, and the other is inflammation. And the point here is that mitochondria are centrally involved in both of these drivers. Mitochondria are what generate energy, and that is the difference between life and death. And I can't find a pathology in which mitochondria are not involved. And the shocking thing is, you will never hear the word mitochondria from any conventionally trained doctor. And the reason for that is doctors are now no longer educated by academics. They're educated by big pharma. And big pharma's only responsibility is to their shareholders. And they want as many sick people as they possibly can, because that's what generates the revenue. So big pharma is all about symptom suppression with drugs, not looking at root causes of problems. And since doctors are now educated by big pharma, they don't learn about mitochondria, because if you sort somebody's mitochondria out, you cure them. And remember big pharma's mantra, a patient cured is a customer lost. So what AONM and other such organisers are doing are they're teaching people to become their own doctors. So you have to work things out for yourself from first principles. And mitochondria are absolutely central to all of this. Now, this is not a very good slide, but it just illustrates some of the problems that we know mitochondria are essentially involved in. But basically, they're involved in everything. And the early stages of mitochondrial failure is often characterized by fatigue. So that's another book that we wrote. Later stages of mitochondrial failure are characterized by all these things: premature aging and organ failures. Some of you may have heard on the radio this morning, they said that a study had been done, a group of people who they took blood from in the 1960s and then went on to see what they succumbed to. And the most important predictor of dementia is your immune function. That was very closely associated with dementia. And the reason for that is I can't tell the difference between the immune system and the brain. You know, they're very similar cells, equally intelligent, decision-making, essential for keeping us fit and well, extremely demanding of energy. You know, the brain, although it weighs just 2% of the body, it consumes 20% of all the energy generated. Again, the immune system, enormously demanding of energy. If somebody has flu, when their immune system is fighting hard to get rid of that virus, guess what? They're bedbound. Why? Because all the energy goes to the immune system to fight it. So if we can look after our mitochondria and our energy delivery mechanisms, then our heart's going to work well, our brain's going to work well, etc., etc., etc. It's just another little clue as to how important mitochondria are. So the first thing we have to ask is, why and how do mitochondria go slow? And the analogy that I like to use, of course, is the car analogy. So you've got to have the right fuel in the tank. And that's all about DART, which I could talk all day about and probably have in another instance. They're deficient in some sort of essential raw material. So for our car engine to work, they've got to have, fuel injection systems and air intake and pistons. And I'm not very good at mechanics, as you can see, but you've got to have essential raw materials. Or because they're blocked by something or damaged by something. So if we're poisoned by something, it's like throwing a handful of sand into a finely tuned engine. It's going to clog it up in unexpected ways. Or the control mechanisms are abnormal, the thyroid accelerator pedal or the adrenal gearbox. Or, and this is now, as Gillian knows, one of my favorite subjects, poor quality exclusion zone water. And we could happily do another evening on this, because with exclusion zone water, or gel water as it's called, what that does, it's absolutely essential to hold all the enzymes and membranes in the correct three-dimensional shape in order to be efficient producers of energy. So the analogy I use is, if you've got a car factory, you've got to have the right components coming in at exactly the right time, at exactly the right space. The wheels have got to come on at the end, blah, 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 in order for the cars to be produced, efficiently on the production line. And if one thing is missing, or gets put in the wrong place, or doesn't, or comes at the wrong time, then those cars are not going to flow. It's just the same with mitochondria. Everything's got to be in the right place. And the most important thing for that is heat. You've got to have heat, keep the body at just the right temperature for good exclusion zone water. So the first thing, of course, is the fuel in the tank. And as many people know, I'm an advocate of the paleo-ketogenic diet. I'm not going to talk about that, otherwise we're here all evening. And what often goes with a carbohydrate-based diet is an upper fermenting gut. And this is how I treat the upper fermenting gut. So starve. And the reason why the upper fermenting gut is such a problem is because it ferments to produce toxins. And we'll see that when we look at translocated protein studies. So again, we should all be doing this. We should start out with the PK diet. So if you're not already doing a paleo-ketogenic diet, that's what you absolutely must do. And then to treat the upper fermenting gut, starve them out with a PK diet, kill them with vitamin C to bowel tolerance. Most end up on 6 to 8 grams daily. In fact, I'm reading a fascinating book at the moment, which is an account of the work of Linus Pauling. Now, as many of you know, he won 2 Nobel Prizes in his own right. And he was only beaten to a third by Watson and Crick, but very clever man. Now, he devoted the last third of his life to the research of vitamin C and its impact on health. And he pointed out that obviously humans cannot make their own vitamin C, and other animals which do make their own vitamin C, per weight if you base it on weight for weight, they make about 5.6 grams a day. So that's what the rest of the mammalian world do. So we should do the same. So my view is we'd all be taking about 5 to 6 grams a day. That's about a teaspoonful. I put mine in a glass of warm water because it dissolves really well, slug it down, and then I do brush my teeth with a bit of bicarbonate afterwards to stop any damage to the enamel. So vitamin C, everybody should be doing that without exception, even children. Or rather, especially children. And then you kill also with iodine, and we're all iodine deficient, and that's the sort of dose that I like. Approx, I can't spell. So 3 drops of Lugol's iodine last thing at night. And the way I remember that is I leave them in my bathroom next to the toothbrush, and as I'm brushing my teeth, I remember to take the iodine in the night, and I remember to take the vitamin C in the morning. So everybody should be doing that. But I started off life as an NHS GP and started work as a GP in 1982. Thought I knew it all, rapidly discovered I didn't, and I've never not been on a steep learning curve ever since. But in the 1980s, one of the commonest preparations was the tired all the time patient, the TATT. About 40% of consultations were centered around fatigue, as people soon discovered that doctors and GPs were hopeless at treating that disease, or that symptom rather, that those numbers fell away. But I was always interested in asking the question why. And in the early days, I could help some people by putting them on elimination diets, because by then I discovered I was allergic and I thought food allergy explained everything. It's still very important. And again, what's so fascinating about doctors these days, not only does the word mitochondria not exist in general practice, but neither does food allergy. It's barely given any time whatsoever, and it certainly doesn't appear in the standard medical textbooks. But so I was able to help some people with elimination diets, with some supplements. And during the 1990s, I quietly accumulated, a whole heap of patients who were tired all the time, who hadn't been helped by my modest interventions. And I was thinking, why? And at that time, I then bumped into John McLaren Howard, who was then working at Biolab in London. And if anybody should be given the Nobel Prize for biochemistry, it should be that man. Because I was able to ask the difficult questions, relatively easy questions, and he had the difficult problem of finding a test that was relevant to that question. And when I said, what about mitochondrial function in patients with fatigues, he started off measuring the respiratory enzymes in mitochondria. That's complexes 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. No obvious correlation there. Although what was quite interesting is one of the things he did measure then, which was levels of NAD, vitamin B3. And that was the only thing that showed a correlation. The lower levels your vitamin B3, the greater your risk of fatigue syndromes and vice versa. So, we then had another discussion. I said, well, it's mitochondria. I want to test the mitochondrial function. And John discovered a test that had been used in research circles only, which was to measure ATP profiles. And he developed that to have clinical relevance. And those are the questions that I wanted, and those are the questions that he answered. Now, John has now retired, so we can no longer get this test in this country, but we can get very similar tests through the Academy of Nutritional Medicine. And Professor Birgitte Koenig does these tests. And if you want to order those tests, then if you click on those links, then you can access those tests. Okay, but one of the joys of this testing is that we were able to objectively measure how well mitochondria work with an actual number, with an actual score. And that means we could, with a simple algorithm, we had an objective measure of how well mitochondria can produce and recycle ATP. And the first few tests that I was doing with patients, clinically looked to me like it was there was a very good correlation. So we decided to set up an audit or a test, a trial to see if this was in fact true. So we went on to test this in 71 patients. And I'd collected these patients between these over these 3 years. All had received the basic workup that I knew about then: diet, supplements, sleep, pacing, all the usual stuff. The patient came to see me, and we agreed a clinical ability score called the Bell scale between us. Blood sent to Acumen, and Acumen underdid the test blind. So John McLaren-Howe did the tests. He didn't know how fatigued the patients were. He just did the biochemistry. We scored the ATP profiles, and then sent the results to a third party, which was initially Craig. Thank you, Craig, mathematician. Craig started doing some of the number crunching, and then all the figures went to Professor Norman Booth at Mansfield College, Oxford. Norman had an interest in this because his wife had very severe ME. And we published this in the International Journal of Clinical Experimental Medicine in 2009. That is the abstract, which you don't have to read now. But the most important graph, which I have to say, I nearly fell over when I saw this graph. It was so brilliant. This is a measure of mitochondrial energy score that John had worked out from his ATP studies against the chronic fatigue syndrome ability scale, according to the Bell disability scale. And as you can see, there's an almost straight line relationship. I mean, it was the most brilliant correlation. And this is compared to control. See, these were normal people that John had accumulated, people who'd sent in bloods for other reasons. So this was really the first solid bit of evidence that mitochondria represent the central pathophysiological lesion in people with fatigue syndromes. So I've continued to collect data, and then, of course, we looked at patients who request the repeat testing, and that became the subject of a third paper, because what I wanted to know is, do these regimes work? Are they effective? So again, I didn't have the money to do this in a very controlled way, so I just accepted patients as they came in, and we went through exactly the same process of testing. We agreed, the patients came to see me, we sent bloods off to Acumen, and they repeated the test. Having done, at that time, it was the Stone Age diet, which I've now upgraded to the paleo-ketogenic diet because it's lower in low carbohydrate. Discussion about sleep, nutritional supplements, right balance of work stress. And then, of course, each individual patient had various problems because in parallel with measuring mitochondrial function, John was also measuring the level of essential nutrients like magnesium, CoQ10, acetyl L-carnitine, ATP, and therefore we could treat that with D-ribose and so on. So they all had tailored supplements. And then where they see mitochondria, again, when John was doing these tests, you could see if mitochondria were going slow, either because they were deficient in something or because they were blocked by something. So we were doing detox regimes for some people. And again, we'll have a look at some of those in a jiffy. And these are as a picture of the results. Now, there were 34 patients in total. So obviously they're all anonymized. The purple score was the mitochondrial function score, i.e. how well ATP was being generated before. And then the orange columns are the after. So you can see this patient ZY, very poor mitochondrial function first time, vastly improved second time. And all these, the first 30 patients here, as you can see, without exception, improved the mitochondrial function. And then it had 4 patients, these ones at the end here, AX, AV, ZB, and AO, who had, for whatever reason, had not done the regimes. And again, what was so fascinating is in every single case, their mitochondrial function got worse. So although the numbers are very small, the statistics are compelling because there just wasn't one that was out of line. It was quite an extraordinary result. So unfortunately, say they're not available, but Professor Koenig, as I mentioned, does do them. Oh, I spelled Koenig wrong. Sorry about that. And I've done, in total, I've did 1,036 mitochondrial function tests for patients until Acumen closed, and I've collected all that data. And I know that from my own clinical experience, all these things hold true. And the overall strategy, obviously, is for improving mitochondrial function. We now is to give mitochondria the right fuel in the tank, and they prefer to run on ketones. Give mitochondria the raw materials to work, and we'll go through what they are in a second. Reduce the toxic stress that's blocking mitochondria. Take melatonin, and I think this is really important. Melatonin, you see, mitochondria have their own DNA. And the DNA in mitochondria is circular, and it mixes round in the within the mitochondria. It's not protected in a little nucleus away from all the busy areas where energy is being generated. And what that means is that mitochondrial DNA is very susceptible to damage, because when you're generating energy, and the energetics are involved are massive. Just to give you a little clue about this, the electrical potential across a mitochondrial membrane is the same as the electrical potential in a lightning strike. Of course, the mitochondrial membrane is very thin, so that's what gives it a large gradient. But it illustrates the point. There's a huge amount of energy being packed into a very tiny space. And when that happens, you get free radicals, you get potential damage. And those free radicals can damage mitochondrial DNA. And that may well be the underlying pathophysiology that drives cancer. So to protect against that, mitochondria make melatonin. Again, we're all taught the melatonin is made by the pineal gland in the brain. Yes, it is, but much more is made in mitochondria. And melatonin is one of the most important antioxidants within mitochondria to mop up those free radicals. Now, I think we should be taking up to 50 milligrams at night. The usual recommended dose is maybe 1 to maybe 9 milligrams, but melatonin is gloriously safe stuff. And it's also very cheap. I've given you a link there where you can get melatonin from Piping Rock. If you get then email round robin, they're always doing offers on melatonin. And the other day I was able to get 120 10 milligram tablets for about £6. So this is very cheap and very doable. Keep your melatonin next to your toothbrush so that reminds you to take it. Melatonin is very important. And people, again, they say to me, oh, if I take melatonin, won't I switch off my own body's production of melatonin? And the answer to that is no. Because that's not how melatonin production is switched off. Melatonin production is switched off by light. That's the sensitive, and it's produced largely at night. So no, you're not going to switch off endogenous productions. And then we have to sort the control mechanisms of mitochondria. So you've got the thyroid accelerator pedal and the adrenal hormones. And then we need heat, A, to allow mitochondria to work, and B, to detox. And we'll come on to that in a jiffy. And again, it's important we do that in the right order. So what are the raw materials that mitochondria need? And because I now know that these interventions work reliably well, we don't need to test everybody who comes to us. As I say, tests are expensive. Diets are really important. And I would much rather people spent their precious reserves on getting the best quality food they possibly can, ideally organic. And I know organic food is expensive, but the most widely used pesticide in the world today is glyphosate. Essential reading, Stephanie Seneff's book, A Toxic Legacy, where she points out that glyphosate, it is an organophosphate, and organophosphates inhibit this chemical process, which is called oxidative phosphorylation. In addition, glyphosate is very damaging to the microbiome. About 54% of microbes in the microbiome are sensitive to and have the potential to be killed by glyphosate. So spend your precious resources on essential diets and essential supplements. Niacinamide, absolutely. Magnesium, critical, absolutely vital. Again, back to the car analogy, I think of coenzyme Q10 as the oil of our engine. It's an important mopper up of acceptor and donator of electrons, without which electrons can't flow. Magnesium, I think, is the spark plug of our engine. That's what allows things to function. And you've got to have vitamin D to be absorbed. My view is we should be taking vitamin D 10,000 IU daily. You might think that's a big dose. It's equivalent to about half an hour of sunshine. Guess what primitive woman got? 12 hours of sunshine. So that is not a big dose. And at that level, there has never, ever been any toxicity from vitamin D anywhere in the world. Vitamin B3, again, extremely safe as niacinamide. Probably the best form of niacinamide is niacin, which makes you flush, but many people don't tolerate that. So niacinamide is very well tolerated. Carnitine, I think, again, that's another really important electron donor and receiver within mitochondria. Acetyl L-carnitine, I think of that as your fuel, as you fill your car up with fuel at petrol. That's the nozzle by which you get fuel into mitochondria. So carnitine picks up acetate groups and the cell cytosol, flicks them into mitochondria where they can be used as fuel, and then goes back to grab another acetate group. So again, that's vital. Lots of that in meat. So again, when I re-looked at my mitochondrial function test that we'd done, the vegetarians and the vegans were very often had very low levels of acetyl L-carnitine. If you're eating meat and you're digesting it well because you've got a non-fermenting upper gut, then you're likely to have normal levels of carnitine. But again, another interesting thing I picked up when I went through all my 1,036 test results, about a third of all were vegetarians, which is much higher than the general population. Again, it illustrates the point that being a vegetarian or vegan is a risk factor for mitochondrial dysfunction. Vitamin B12, again, another really important antioxidant, and also vital for the methylation cycle. And the methylation cycle is responsible for healing and repair. And of course, as we've mentioned, mitochondria, in producing lots of free radicals, that causes lots of damage. And we heal and repair that with methylation cycle during sleep. D-ribose, that is very useful for replacing, for regenerating ATP if we've overdone things. Again, when I remember looking at thinking D-ribose, 5 grams a day, oh, that's tiny. Look how big the body is. I'm about 60 kilograms, 5 grams. I can't see that's going to make a difference. But when you look at the actual individual figures, what's so amazing is that the total pool of ATP in the body, and remember ATP is the energy molecule, is about 80 or 100 grams. It's tiny. I have to say, I still can't get my head around this, that we've got such tiny amounts of ATP in the whole body. And that's why if you've got a pool of maybe 80 or 90 grams, then 5 or 15 grams has the potential to regenerate, 5 or 15% of that, maybe a little bit more. The reason why we get away with 80 grams is because of the rate at which an ATP molecule is recycled. So it's generated in mitochondria. ATP is then transported across mitochondrial membranes to the cytosol, where it's used to do a job, contract a muscle, conduct a nerve impulse, make a hormone or whatever. And then it's recycled back into mitochondria, where it's as ADP, where it's regenerated. That process takes about 10 seconds. So the speed of all this is just mind-blowing. In fact, so much so that if you totted up all those cyclings, we're generating more than our body weight of ATP every single day, 70 or 80 kilograms of ATP. So again, it's just an illustration of what an extraordinary process chemiosmosis is. Okay, so to say, we can do that test with Professor Koenig if you wish to do so. Again, this is just a little thing I thought I'd slip in, is the Kiesel 10 study. I hope I pronounced that correctly, where they simply gave people, 443 male and female volunteers, aged 70 to 88, a 5-year study. All they gave them was selenium 200 micrograms and coenzyme Q10 200 milligrams. That's all they gave them. And that halved their cardiovascular mortality over the next 5 years. So it just illustrates how vital those two things are. Selenium in my sunshine salt, 1 teaspoon of that contains 200 micrograms of selenium. So that's where you get your selenium from. And CoQ10. I usually recommend 100 milligrams because it's quite expensive. In his book, Dr. Sinatra's book, The Sinatra Solution, who's a cardiologist who started off life as a conventional cardiologist with the drugs and the pacemakers and the surgery, then switched entirely to nutritional medicine and was extremely successful. He uses CoQ10 up to 400 or 500 milligrams a day. Again, it's very safe. It's just a bit expensive. So that's what we have to do to give our mitochondria the raw materials. And then we have to think about what's blocking and what's inhibiting mitochondria. And again, thanks to John McLaren at Acumen, he did studies looking at the rate of oxidative phosphorylation and also translocator protein studies. And again, I went through my patients, all the studies that have been done, and pulled out the things that come up time and time and time again. And these are in order of frequency. And the number one thing that came up that inhibits mitochondria is lactic acid. Now, lactic acid is what is generated when we switch from the very efficient aerobic metabolism, where we're generating ATP through mitochondria, to the incredibly, and where in which one molecule of acetate will produce between 32 and 36 molecules of ATP, to the incredibly inefficient anaerobic metabolism, where we generate ATP through fermentation. And when that happens, one molecule of acetate will produce 2 molecules of ATP. So it's horribly inefficient. And a side effect of that is to produce lactic acid. And I can remember thinking, why do we have this mechanism at all? It just doesn't seem to make sense. And actually, Professor Koenig pointed out to me that when we're functioning normally, we should get at least 90% of our energy generation from mitochondria, but we can get up to 10% normally from fermentation. And again, I thought to myself, what's the point of that? And I think, this is not proven, I think that lactic acid is the natural brake that we have for mitochondria. It's the natural mechanisms that stop mitochondria going too fast, spinning out of control. Because as soon as mitochondria don't start to go too fast, they become inefficient. We switch into lactic acid production, and that slows mitochondria down. But this is particularly pertinent for patients who've got a chronic fatigue syndrome, because with a chronic fatigue syndrome, mitochondria don't go very efficiently at all. And we switch very early into lactic acid production. And that generates many of the symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome. Obviously, it makes mitochondria going even slower. When it builds up in muscles, we get muscle pain. And that is one of the mechanisms of fibromyalgia. When it builds up in the heart, we get angina. And because it takes such a long time to clear, because we can't get back into aerobic metabolism efficiently, patients are told, you've got atypical angina. Because the cardiologists, of course, are only used to seeing the angina of poor blood supply, which corrects very quickly with rest. But when the fatigue syndrome patients stop and rest, it takes an awful long time to clear that lactic acid. So they get this very prolonged so-called atypical chest pain, but it is angina. So this illustrates the importance of how patients with fatigue syndrome must pace activity very carefully. It's very boring, I know. And as we put in place all the interventions and get more energy, it becomes less of an issue. But pacing is really important. And the difference between normal fatigue and pathological fatigue is when you pay for it the next day. So if you get post-exertional malaise the day after, then you've overdone things the day before. And guess what? That applies to us all. Steve Redgrave, after he won his 4th gold medal, he would have pushed himself to his absolute limit. He wouldn't have been able to repeat that performance the next day because of the muscle damage and the lactic acid burn. So pacing is really important. The second thing that comes up is products of the upper fermenting gut. And again, well, we've dealt with that, haven't we? PK diet, vitamin C to bowel tolerance, iodine, mastic gum possibly. These days, I tend to go for MSM, methyl sulfonyl methane, which is rapidly becoming one of my favorite multitasking tools. Third on the list are dyes. Again, I found this extraordinary, but hair dyes, if you're taking pills that are coloured red or yellow, or foods that have got a colouring, they can get stuck onto translocated protein and inhibit it. So these diamino compounds are really very toxic. And hair dyes are probably the most common offenders. The only safe dye you can use is henna, but that means you've all got to be a redhead, or you can do what I do. You just have to go grey gracefully. As P.G. Wodehouse, my favourite comic writer, stated in one of his books, there is a cure for grey hair. It was invented by a Frenchman, and it's called the guillotine. But I think I'll keep my head. Okay, and then what else comes up? Parabens. Often used in toothpaste and other disinfectants. Remember, you should put nothing in your mouth and you should put nothing on your skin that you're not prepared to eat, because that stuff is absorbed very well through the mouth. That's why many toothpastes are toxic, and you absorb things very well through your skin. Polybrominated biphenyls, fire retardants, they come up very frequently. Pesticides, again, we've touched on glyphosate, but organophosphates and whatever. And I've done many tests of many fat biopsies looking for pesticides and volatile organic compounds, and I've never found a normal result. Nickel comes up very frequently on those, and also you see mercury and other toxic metals. Again, malondialdehyde, that was another one that very regularly comes up on translocated protein, and that is caused by free radical damage. So, as we've discussed already, if you generate lots of energy, you're going to generate lots of free radicals. And we mop those up with B12, methylation cycle, vitamin C, and melatonin. And then occasionally John will pick up mycotoxins, viral proteins, immunoglobulins, and of course that explains one of the mechanisms by which chronic infection can inhibit mitochondrial function. Okay, so broadly speaking, there are 4 groups of toxins which demand different methods of diagnosis and treatment. And again, you don't have to do the test to diagnose, just put in place the regimes and do them now. Don't wait till you get sick. Do them now, because we live in a toxic world. Say products of the upper fermenting gut. Well, we know how to do that, don't we? Pesticides and volatile organic compounds. Yes, you can measure them with a urine test, but you can detox them with heating regimes, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Toxic metals come up, and the point is these are not excreted with heating regimes. We have to get rid of those with some sort of chelation. So again, glutathione gets rid of them quite well in combination with good levels of minerals. But the intervention I love to use is DMSA, which is of proven benefit. And even before it was recognised that chelating agent was effective through its way of getting rid of toxic metals, it was often used to treat cardiovascular disease. So people presenting with angina, arteriosclerosis could often reverse many of their symptoms just by taking DMSA. And then, of course, we got endotoxin, fungal mycotoxins, immune mediators, and of course, we can get those tested for, if necessary, at Armin laboratories through AONM. So as I started doing these tests, I collected all the data, of course, and to see what happened. And initially, I used to do lots of tests because I was interested in doing lots of tests, but of course they're expensive. I rarely do these tests now because I know these regimes work. I'd much rather people spent their money on getting the best possible food and some supplements rather than tests which aren't going to change management. So I've collected some data using the fat biopsies, the translocated protein studies, DNA adducts, or whatever. and found that the levels came down reliably well with heating regimes. I'm ashamed to say I've yet to publish those figures, but when Norman Booth had all the figures and he was going to publish them, the poor old boy died before he got round to doing that. So I'll have to put that on Craig's wish list. But we have some wonderful, a similar study done by Bill Ray in America. Now, Bill Ray is an interesting guy. He was a cardiovascular surgeon doing heart surgery, and he was poisoned by the anesthetic gases and developed a very severe multiple chemical sensitivity, which meant he was no longer able to work in those poisonous operating theatres. Nowadays, they're much better about scavenging the gases, but in the 1950s and the 1960s, that didn't happen. And he set up the Dallas Environmental Center for patients with chemical sensitivities and other such. And he developed techniques, heating regimes, to treat these patients, to get rid of these toxins. So the idea was he would diagnose them clinically, and then he measured their toxic chemicals in their blood and looked at their symptom scores before and after his heating regimes. Now, what he was doing, not all his patients were fatigue syndrome patients. They were just chemically sensitive. So he was doing three things. So they were exercising, they were having massage, and then a sauna and washing it off. And they were cycling through these three regimes: exercise and exercise bike to get hot and sweaty, massage, saunaing regimes, and showering it off, and coming in repeatedly. And these are some of the chemicals he was testing: pentachloropheноls, polychlorinated biphenyls, etc., organochlorine pesticides. You can read that as well as I can. And the symptom scores before the saunaing, he developed a scale, 2,100 units. After saunaing, average 2,010 units, i.e. he massively improved their symptoms and signs. And when he actually measured the toxic levels in the blood, if you assume they were at 100% at the beginning of the regime, most of them were substantially reduced over, so 63% were lower, a few were higher, and we'll come on to the possible reasons for that in a moment. Well, I'll explain now. He was measuring levels in the blood. Most chemicals get dumped, or the fat-soluble chemicals get dumped in fat. Because they're fat soluble. And again, when I was doing the fat biopsies, results are coming back in milligrams per kilogram. But when you do a blood test, they come back in micrograms per kilogram, i.e. 1,000-fold difference. So the reason why, most were lower, some were higher, 37% were higher, all the same. That reason is because they were still coming out of the fat. So that made perfect sense to me when I looked at those figures. And what was also interesting is the complications of therapy in the 210 patients. And of the 210, 200 had an initial exacerbation of their original symptoms. And again, that's a very important observation, because again, it illustrates the point that these chemicals are stored in their fat, where, hopefully they're tucked out of the biochemical way. You sauna and you get hot and you mobilize them into the bloodstream and you get an acute poisoning. And this illustrates the detox reactions we see when we start to put in place healing regimes. One person had a seizure and some had hypothermia. Again, some even got gut symptoms. And this is another fascinating statistic. Half of them, their liver enzymes increased. Now, of course, it's the liver that's responsible for detoxing substances that appear in the bloodstream. And liver enzymes are very sensitive to what's coming through. And if there are a lot of toxins coming through, then the liver will increase its output of enzymes to deal with that toxic load. The example that we all know about, of course, is gamma-GT. Gamma-GT is one of the liver detox enzymes that only detoxes ethyl alcohol. And so if you go to your doctor and you have a high gamma GT, they'll say, oh, you're obviously a secret drinker, aren't you? But one of the commonest upper gut fermenters is yeast. And if you've got yeast in the upper gut and you eat some sugar, then you are going to ferment that sugar to produce ethyl alcohol. If I sat down and scoffed a pound of grapes, then effectively I'm eating a bag of sugar, fructose, and of course, there's yeast on the outside of those grapes. So I'm immediately inoculated with yeast, and it will start fermenting away in my nice warm stomach and generate ethyl alcohol. and some people are very susceptible to this. So that's just an illustration of how liver enzymes can be induced. So half of them induce their liver enzymes in response to the detoxing. And again, cardiovascular, muscular aches, again, these are probably allergy reactions to the chemicals that are coming out. Okay. Now, my experience of doing these heating regimes is that about 50 such heating regimes will halve the body load. And they come out exponentially. So you never get to zero. It just gets closer and closer to baseline. But the body can tolerate a certain amount of toxic load because we have the liver enzymes to deal with that. So the point is, we live in a toxic world. We are all poisoned, without exception. And we should all be doing these heating regimes. Now, of course, fatigue syndrome patients can't do that, but the Epsom salt baths are ideal. Epsom salts are very cheap. You can order them direct from epsomsalts.co.uk, and 20 kilograms cost about 35 quid. So a 50-gram bath costs you less than £1. So we should all be doing this at least once a week, maybe even twice a week, simply to deal with the chemicals that we all have in our fat because we live in a poisonous world. So don't wait for the test, just get on and do the things. These are other supplements that also help to detox. I'm not going to read this out because you can all read as well. But again, we should all be doing this to reduce our toxic load. So once we are in a position where the mitochondria is sorted, then we can tackle the control mechanisms, which is the thyroid accelerator pedal and the adrenal gearbox. Both impact on energy delivery mechanisms. And it's really important to match energy delivery mechanisms with demand. Because if there's no match, if there's a mismatch there, then energy is wasted, and that is evolutionary disaster. Because what determines our survival was largely food availability, and if there's plentiful food, then we don't want to waste that energy just our mitochondria going mad. We want to store it as fat because that's survival value for the winter. And in fact, this brings me on to another issue, which I'll just mention briefly, which is the evolutionary techniques that we have evolved to conserve energy and to conserve food. Now, when food is abundant, what we should do is get a bit addicted to that food, eat it and eat it and eat it and get fat. And that's what happens in the autumn. In the autumn, we have a windfall. We have free food, fruit, nuts, seeds, root vegetables, in abundance. And with farming, we can increase that abundance further. And when that food comes along and we have a free lunch, we should sit and eat and eat and eat. And in parallel with that, we don't want to waste our energy. So we want to sit around and do nothing. So what this means is in the short term, eating a lot of food and getting fat makes us naturally fatigued. It's a natural energy conservation mechanism. But of course, what happens is when that food runs out and it is there no longer, we start to fast. And in the short term, fasting makes us clever. Endless studies looking at rats, their ability to solve mazes improves in the fasting state. And it also gives us more physical energy, and that makes us more effective gatherers of food, whether that's hunting or farming. So an example of this is the samurai warriors will fast for 24 hours before any battle because it increases their reflexes and it makes them stronger. It makes them more able to fight better. Now, of course, that doesn't last forever, but it illustrates the point that food makes us fat and fatigued in the short term, and fasting gives us brain energy and physical energy. And so, yes, we need to eat all the right foods, paleo-ketogenic, but the next step is to do windows of time of fasting rather than just eating 3 meals a day. Okay, so it's the thyroid and the adrenal hormones that say the accelerator pedal and the gearbox of our car, and that allows us to closely match energy delivery to energy demands. And we have to do things in the right order because adrenal hormones and thyroid hormones manifest their actions on mitochondria. And if the mitochondria are not in a fit state to respond, then you really are flogging a dead horse, as I call it. Okay. Okay, I think I've talked about that. It's typical of me to jump ahead of myself. And these are the symptoms of the underactive thyroid. Now, I can just skip through these. the reason, say, the thyroid gland is the accelerator pedal of our mitochondrial engines. The underactive thyroid is very common. And the key point about diagnosing the underactive thyroid is, yes, blood tests are a useful guide, but we also have to look at the symptoms and we have to look at the signs. And these are all the typical symptoms of the underactive thyroid: fluid retention. Again, you often get a clue when people do the PK dart, because when we're on a PK dart, we need thyroid hormones to fat burn. So our requirement for thyroid hormones increases. And very often we unmask the underactive thyroid when we start doing a PK dart. So if the paleoketogenic diet initially makes you worse, then that might be a pointer to an underactive thyroid. Sleep disturbance. Thyroid hormones are responsible for our diurnal rhythm. Muscle weakness, constipation, headaches, all these give us useful clues. The adrenal gland, again, the adrenal fatigue results where there's been unremitting stress. And yes, life is very stressful, but the worst stress of all is probably a stress that dates from childhood. Bullying, sexual abuse. I remember talking to Keith Eaton, who is a very dear friend and wonderful doctor. He was always worth spending time with. Bless him, he died, 2008, something like that, I suppose. And I remember him saying then that his chronic fatigue syndrome and ME patients, very often there was a history of child abuse. And I remember thinking at the time, what's all that about? I don't get that. And he went on to explain, well, child abuse, whatever that may be, hardwires young people for hypervigilance. They're constantly hypervigilant, and that massively disrupts sleep. So they can't heal and repair because they're not sleeping well, and their brain is constantly activated, and that kicks a huge emotional hole in the energy bucket, as well as, and we use adrenal glands to try to deal with that stress, and the adrenal glands eventually fatigue. And then, adjust the dose using core temperatures. Now, core temperatures are a pain to measure, but I've just worked out a really easy way to do it. Get yourself one of these. They cost about, 12 quid on Amazon. It's just a far infrared thermometer. And instead of pointing at your head, that gives you your core temperature, point it at the back of the throat. So take a deep breath in, hold it for a second, because that allows the air to warm up to body temperature, and exhale. And as you exhale, point this at the back of the throat. So like this. So I take deep breath in, hold it, slowly exhale. There we go. 37.0. That's my core temperature. So it's a really quick and easy way to measure your core temperature. If you just point it at your head, I'll let it go off. If you just point at your head, 36.1, because I'm sitting in a rather cold room. So skin temperature is not a good measure of core temperature, but I've tried it on numerous occasions doing it that way, and you get much more reliable results. So that's the way to measure your core temperature. And the point is, the core temperature is the sum total of all your energy delivery mechanisms. Your PK dart, your mitochondrial function, of course, which generates it, the thyroid accelerator pedal, the adrenal gearbox, and of course, oxygen, which is to do with breathing. So to improve mitochondrial function, you have to do it all and do it in the right order. And we should all be doing all this stuff as much as we can now. Don't wait till you get ill. We know mitochondria are involved in dementia, in cancer, and heart disease. Don't wait until you get those pathologies to put this all in place. And as proof of that, that this does work, this is an old boy who came to join me 7 years ago. Tony Ditcham. This is his photograph when he was 100 years old. He had no pathology, no dementia, no heart disease, no cancer. He was really very fit and very well. And he died last October in his sleep, aged 102. So that's why I said at the beginning of the talk, I'm hoping if I get to 102, I will settle for that. So he fought the the good fight. Obviously, he was 7 years with me, where, of course, I fed him a paleo ketogenic diet and gave him lots of supplements and all that stuff that we've talked about. And he died very peacefully. In fact, the day before he died, he was doing a book signing. I've got a video of him signing his books and chatting away about the content. So what we can live all our lives to a very high level and then drop off the perch, very quickly when the moment arises. Okay, so I hope I've got that within the hour. And if anybody's got any questions, then I can either look in the Q. Oh, hang on, there's a Q&A. Do you want to read out the questions, Gillian, or do you want me to whiz through the Q&A box?
Yes, I can read through them.
Okay, far away then, and I'll try and pick up on those.
Oh dear, there was one question in the chat, and I will go back to the chat soon as well, that came in right at the beginning when you mentioned the EZ water, where the participant asked, well, is that, what kind of water is that? And I know that you don't have time to talk about that now, just to mention that you will be giving a talk on that on the 7th of October, the single most important molecule for life. But if you could, is it possible to just summarize that in a couple of sentences, because it's so long to wait until October?
Okay, I will do my best. Okay, exclusion zone water was described by, or first discovered and described by Professor Gerald Pollack, who's a physicist. And he points out that we know water exists in 3 phases. It's a liquid, that's what's in that glass there, as an ice cube, as ice, which is a solid, and as a liquid, as steam. But it also exists in another phase, which he calls 4th phase water, for obvious reasons. And that's what water molecules do against a hydrophilic surface. And all membranes in the body, cell membranes, mitochondrial membranes, lining of blood vessels, they're all made up of a lipid sandwich, and the outside is hydrophilic. Now, against the hydrophilic surface, they line up in a honeycomb-like structure in layers, a little bit like graphite. And these layers can be millions of layers thick, so much so you can actually see exclusion zone water. They can be up to 1 millimeter thick if you get the right conditions. Now, what's so fascinating about these honeycombs is they are comprised of alternate atoms of hydrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, oxygen. Now, we know the molecular formula of water is H2O. So if you add that up, those honeycombs, it doesn't add up. It doesn't add up electrically. You've got too many protons. So what that means in practice is that every membrane surface in the body is negatively charged and the protons are excluded. That's why it's called exclusion zone water. So, and it's the old story in nature, you don't get out for out. To get charge separation, which is the start of generating energy, in fact, Pollack demonstrates you can actually generate energy from exclusion zone water. If you put an electrode in gel water and another one in the liquid water beyond that, you can light a light up. So, you don't get out for out. But the point is this exclusion zone water, I say, has a very powerful structure. It's called gel water. And that structure is very stable. And in fact, I can go on to it might explain how homeopathy works, for example. But of course, all it's not just cell membranes. Big molecules, they have many hydrophilic surfaces, and even the hydrophobic surfaces will generate a different form of exclusion zone water. Instead of forming a honeycomb, you get so-called clathrates formed. But the point is this gel water, this exclusion zone water, this structured water, which holds molecules in precisely the correct 3-dimensional space to make them work efficiently. So, for example, within ATP synthase, which is the molecule that sits on mitochondrial membrane that generates ATP, it's one of the most complex molecules in the body. All the atoms have to be within within less than 1 atom diameter to function correctly. And that occurs courtesy of gel phase water. Now, exclusion zone water. Now, as I say, we don't get out for now. For that to happen, we've got to have some energy coming in. Now, you can get gel water from any background electromagnetic radiation, and we get that from space. We also get it from the sun. But the thickest, the structure, the sort of quality and thickness of gel water that we need for life occurs when the body temperature is about 37 degrees centigrade. And we get that from heat that we generate from within the body and heat that comes from the outside world. So this explains why when we become hypothermic for whatever reason, if our body temperature drops, mitochondria start to malfunction. They go slower and slower and slower. And eventually if it goes cold enough, then we will die. This explains why poikilotherms, snakes, for example, who also have mitochondria, they have to warm up in the sunshine. When they're cold, they're slow and they're torpid, but you warm them up, suddenly their mitochondria start to function normally, and they can move like lightning. So I say we can talk about this at length on, 7th of October. That's a long time to wait, Julie. I think we ought to have one sooner than that. But it's the point is background heat. And as I say, you can measure that, you can measure your core temperature very efficiently, quickly now. Gives us a very good clue as to what's going on in mitochondria.
Thank you. And you'll be giving us lots of other tips, I know, on how to increase that kind of special water. So looking forward to that. I'll just go through some of the Q&A now and then switch to the chat. So David asks, he's had Epstein-Barr and other infections, Coxsackie as well in the muscles. He's wondering whether that can lead to mitochondrial failure. In fact, I think he's assuming it can, and is asking about methylene blue or valcyclovir.
Absolutely. When we are born, we're born usually relatively free from infection. And as we go through life, we acquire infections. And one of the problems with the herpes virus and both, Epstein-Barr virus and cytomegalovirus, they're both herpes infections. We have them for life. We can't get rid of them. So we are reliant on an immune system that works really well to keep those little wretches at bay. And for the immune system to work really well, it's got to have energy and it's got to have the raw materials, i.e. all the stuff we've talked about this evening. But in addition, microbes are very clever. They want to make themselves at home in our delicious bodies. Because of course, if you can get in somebody's body, you're nice and warm, you're well fed, you're well watered, you're protected from other enemies, and you can have free sex and replicate. So it's we're a very desirable place to be. So you have to make our bodies as undesirable as possible. And what all these microbes love are sugar and carbohydrates. So a low carbohydrate diet helps. At the first sign of any acute infection, we try and get rid of it by running a fever, by using vitamin C, by using iodine. So as I call it, life is an arms race. We are a free lunch and we don't want these microbes to get in. Once they got in, how do we tackle that? Well, the first thing, again, is to improve immune function as best we can by giving the immune system the energy and the raw materials that it needs. But some people are helped by other interventions to reduce the total infectious load. And again, our laboratories are very helpful to help us diagnose those or to see what's there. But increasingly, I'm using generalized interventions to reduce the total load. And there are many herbal remedies that are extremely helpful. I don't pretend to be an expert in herbal remedies, but there are other people cleverer than I that are. My starting point to treat these days are often methylene blue. Now, the joy of methylene blue is it's very cheap. Anybody can get it. It's extremely safe, and it is effective against the whole multitude of microbes, all the herpes viruses, many of the influenza viruses and others. And what's also interesting, it's a very good donator and acceptor of electrons. It also improves mitochondrial function. So you're helping things on both sides of the equation. You're improving mitochondrial function and you're reducing the total infectious load. And in parallel with that, DMSO. Now, what's so fascinating about sulfur-containing molecules like DMSO, like magnesium sulfate, like glutathione, like NAC, is they massively improve the quality of fourth phase gel water, as we've just discussed. And my guess is that's one of the mechanisms of action by which DMSO is so helpful. The problem with it is it makes you pong. It makes you smell slightly garlicky, fishy, which can be very antisocial. Now, I'm ashamed to say I must have an awful sense of smell because I didn't notice it when I tried taking the stuff. But when I jumped on Eurostar to go and visit my daughter in Paris, I jumped off and she said, "Oh, hello, Mum." And then she leapt back about 5 meters. "Mother," she said, "you pong. Don't ever use that stuff again." So for some people, it's pretty unbearable, but that's often very helpful. And then combine that with light. Again, light kills so many microbes. Just an example of this, I have a water that comes off the hill, and it passes through an ultraviolet light. and that just kills any microbe that's there. So sunshine is very good at killing microbes. Far infrared light penetrates the skin several centimeters, and that activates the methylene blue and also kills microbes. In the 1930s, before anti-TB therapy was available, and those who could afford it, what I call the RBs, the rich bastards, they cured themselves by going to Switzerland, got to the top of a mountain where they were exposed to sunshine. And again, what's so fascinating about that is those patients, they didn't just get put out in the sunshine. For the first day, only their feet went into sunshine. If they tolerated that, then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, until they could tolerate full spectrum light. In fact, the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1907 was won for light treatment for skin tuberculosis. I can't remember the guy who won it now, but it illustrates the power of light to heal. So I tend to put in these generalized interventions to reduce the total infectious load. But yes, some people need specific antivirals. Dr. Martin Lerner did much work on this. He himself had a cardiomyopathy that was driven by Epstein-Barr virus, and he cured himself with valacyclovir. And he went on to study patients with fatigue syndromes, again, treating them with that drug, getting very good results. 4 studies that are important. They're all detailed on my website. If you go to my website and put in valacyclovir or Martin Lerner in the top right-hand corner, you can see all those studies, the regimes he used and the results he got. So yes, sometimes specific antimicrobials are very helpful.
Brilliant, thank you. Just to go on to another supplement that you had suggested, where there have been various comments because nutritional therapists, naturopaths are not allowed to prescribe melatonin in the UK, only doctors such as yourself. So like, I think circadian 2 milligrams really. So I mean, I know myself that patients are allowed to buy it. So as long as they know where it's available, that's no problem. It's just not something that we're allowed to recommend. Is that something you would suggest as well for the
Absolutely correct. And what you have to remember is that whenever us naturopathic doctors discover a treatment that is cheap, effective, safe, available to all, and whatever, then Big Pharma deliberately puts out misinformation to discredit it. So, whenever I say to people, take iodine, the first thing, oh, won't it upset my thyroid? I've been told never to take it. Rubbish. Iodine is essential for normal thyroid function, as well as for normal immune function, brain function, muscle function, heart function, etc., etc., etc. Same with vitamin C. Oh, mustn't take vitamin C. I might get renal stones. Rubbish. Vitamin C is the starting point to treat and prevent renal stones. Vitamin D. Oh, 10,000 units, terribly high, isn't it? The government recommends 400 international units. Rubbish. Same with melatonin. It's extremely safe and very effective, and all of you can buy it yourself. I'm not allowed to sell it, but you can buy it yourself very cheaply from Piping Rock. So whenever you hear such nonsense, follow the money. All these things are very helpful, and we should all be doing them all the time in our toxic world.
Thank you. That answers a lot of questions relating to iodine and the thyroid that we've had as well. And I just want to mention that your book, The Underactive Thyroid, Do It Yourself Because Your Doctor Won't, answers a lot of those questions. So I won't go into the thyroid questions that we've had, but what you've just said resolves a lot of those issues anyway. So going down, the next question was, can mitochondrial function be impaired by long-term exposure to household mold? And what would help support the body when mold remediation is slow and the patient can't move house?
Mold is really difficult, and I don't have any easy answers to molds because they can cause problems for so many reasons. They can cause problems because of infection, although a really good treatment for fungal rhinitis and fungal chest infections is iodine. And this is one of my favorite tools. It's very cheap. You don't even have to buy one. You can make one yourself. It's just a plastic pot with holes in the bottom. And somebody I noticed has whipped my iodine. It's probably me. But a couple of drops of iodine in the mouthpiece and sniff it like that. And if you sniff it, in fact, I can smell iodine in there from the last time I put some in. Then you coat the whole airways, the nose, the sinuses, the pharynx, the larynx, the bronchi, the chest with iodine. And iodine contact kills all microbes at 10 parts per million. There is no microbe that is resistant to iodine. So at the first hint of any respiratory infection, sniff iodine several times a day. I have one of these next to my bed, one in my car, so it's always to hand. And I've now got 5 patients with bronchiectasis, which means they have chronic lung infection. And prior to seeing me, their life went from one antibiotic a bit better, another antibiotic a bit better, until they eventually end up with an MRSA, and then they're in real trouble. Since doing all these regimes that we've talked about that you all need to do and sniffing iodine, their need for antibiotic has dropped to 0. Now, guess what? Drug companies don't want you to know about that, do they? They want you to have their Becanase their Becotide, their salbutamol inhalers, their systemic steroids, their antibiotics, their antifungal, because, follow the money. So, the fact that I've saved the NHS a fortune with that, is totally irrelevant, because the NHS doctors are all trained by Big Pharma. So again, this is why it's so important. Do it yourself, because your doctor won't.
Fantastic. Thank you. We do have, I think, a webinar later on in the year with Kunal, who you all know, talking about our Toxiplex test. And maybe you could take part a little in that, Sarah, as well.
Oh, yeah, lovely. Oh, hang on. Yeah, I only talked about mold infection, didn't I? You can also get problems with molds because you can be allergic to them. Mm-hmm. And that's nuisance. But again, one interesting thing about allergy, it is also anti-allergy. Mm-hmm. And the third reason you get problems with mycotoxins is because you can be poisoned by the mycotoxins produced by fungi. Now, the question is, what's the best test? Because you touched on tests. Yes, we can measure mycotoxins. Yes, you can do sputum samples for mold infection, but they're not very reliable. Tests for mold allergy, again, they're not very reliable. The best test I like is to send people to a hot, dry climate or a cold, dry climate for 2 weeks. Because molds can only survive if the air humidity is above 40%. So if you're at the top of a mountain skiing, or if you're in Morocco, hot, dry, Spain, Mediterranean, or right on the seafront, the molds there are very low. And if you are substantially better for doing that, then that is a good indication that you've got a mold problem. It doesn't tell you if you're infected, allergic, or poisoned, but it's a very good clue. And I do have some patients for whom they've ended up moving and going to live in a hot, dry climate because, they said to me, well, I can either choose between being well in living in Crete or Mallorca or Madeira or being sick in this country. And I've decided to be well in Madeira or wherever. So, but yeah, that is a cheap and very desirable test. Hot holiday is quite fun if you can afford it again.
It's a lovely one. Thank you. There is a question that came in earlier, and I just want to ask you that one. It is a complex one, I think. Can you explain multiple drug intolerance syndrome and MCAS in relation to the mitochondria?
Okay.
And, what are patients meant to do who react to everything?
I know.
Even if it was meds that caused the tip into MCAS in the first place.
I know. Well, that is always difficult. And, when it comes to allergy, obviously you do your best to avoid the offenders. And that's a give. But then you just put in place all things anti-inflammatory and all the things that we've discussed, are centered down inflammation. Now, the most pro-inflammatory thing you can do to the body is eat sugar. And one of the most anti-inflammatory things you can do to the body is get into ketosis. And you can maybe help that by taking MCT oil, like coconut oil. Make sure you've got plenty of coconut oil or triglycerides and fats in the diet. Vitamin D is a very good anti-inflammatory. So 10,000 international units is the absolute basic. Some doctors are very happy for their patients to take 20,000 units every day, so long as they're not consuming dairy products, because dairy products got too much calcium in them. Some like 30, 40 or 50,000 IU daily. But at that level, you have to monitor the serum calcium. The only toxicity of vitamin D is hypercalcemia, either calcium going too high. I personally have never seen a case of that. But again, if you're up to 30,000 IU daily, then you would want to keep an eye on the calcium at least. Vitamin D is very anti-inflammatory. Iodine is markedly anti-inflammatory. Good quality sleep is markedly anti-inflammatory. So there are many things we can do that naturally reduce inflammation. But there are 2 extra interventions that are helpful. Now, the way that the body controls the amount of inflammation in the body is through the endogenous cannabinoid system and through the endogenous opioid system. Now, the endogenous cannabinoid system, we can help that by taking some CBD oil. The problem is it's a bit expensive, but it does help sleep. And very often people are helped by, 10, 20, 30, 5, 6, 7 drops of that at night, lasting at night. Just in the mouth, it's well absorbed through the mouth, often improves sleep, and again is anti-inflammatory. To improve the endogenous opiate system, then low-dose naltrexone is very helpful. And you can get that very inexpensively, online, and the dose would be lasting at night 1, 2, 3, maybe 4.5 milligrams. Now, there's a very useful website called run by the Low Dose Naltrexone Trust. Google that, and you will see literally hundreds of clinical studies where low-dose naltrexone has a proven benefit. And what links all those studies, if you look at them, they're all associated with inflammation. So that alone tells us that low-dose naltrexone is a good anti-inflammatory. Ketotifen is, again, you can get that online, is useful for MCAS in particular, but MCAS is always difficult. MCAS means mast cell activation syndrome. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I can't tell the difference between the immune system and the brain. The treatment of both is very similar. And I think that the immune system has emotions, just like the brain has emotions. And the happy immune system is going to fight infection really well. The miserable, depressed immune system is going to give up and not fight infections at all well. But mast cells are the angry cells of the immune system. They're the cells that fire up at the first hint of anything going wrong. I say they're the angry cells. And that's what happens with allergy, because when your mast cells are angry, they produce histamine. And histamine is one of the mediators that drive inflammation, which is characterized, as we all know, by heat, redness, swelling, pain, loss of function, all those nasty things. So antihistamines can be helpful, but I say anything to reduce those angry cells, good quality sleep, being happy is going to be very helpful.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Lindfors from Finland just mentions that he's found that mitochondrial dysfunction is prevalent in fibromyalgia, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis, as well as in depression. And he's published those studies between 2004 and 2016, but no one's interested. This is really a fight. So it must be the same in Finland as I know it is here. I'll just mention one quick point that he's made, which is very interesting, that acetyl L-carnitine from the research he's done doesn't pass the blood-brain barrier, and he suggests L-carnitine taurate. Is that something that you know of?
Oh, that's really interesting, and I've not heard of that. But what I will just flag up here is some fascinating work by Silvia Rivero, who's an Italian researcher, and she was looking at energy delivery mechanisms in the brain. Now, as we mentioned before, although the brain weighs 2% of body weight, it consumes 20% of all the energy generated. So she looked at mitochondria in the brain. And of course, the brain has a large number of axons and nerve fibers, which are very thin. They're very, very narrow. In fact, to give you an illustration of how tiny they are, if you want to get a nerve supply from the spinal cord to the big toe, that is one cell. There's one cell body in the spinal cord, and then the axon extends all the way down the leg to the little toe. And to give you an illustration of how long that is, if that head of the axon was sitting on my desk and was the size of a football, the tail would be in New York. So what that tells us is that tail is very long and very thin. And guess what? Mitochondria don't fit in there. So there are mitochondria in the brain, but they're only within the cell bodies. They don't get into the axons, and we cannot use mitochondria to deliver nerve impulses. So that begs the question, how on earth does, and this is the question that Silvia Rivera is asking, how on earth are those axons powered? And the answer is by the myelin sheath. Now, we were taught at medical school that all these axons have a fatty spiral, like a Swiss roll, around them, and that insulates them. No, that's not right. What's so fascinating, what Rivera demonstrated, is that those myelin sheaths that wrap around axons have adopted mitochondrial biochemistry, and they generate ATP within the myelin sheath. Because, of course, the business of conducting a nerve impulse requires a huge amount of energy. Now, of course, what that means is that you don't need acetyl-carnitine to get ketone groups into myelin sheaths because it's already there. It's the myelin sheath itself that is generating energy, and it's surrounded by fat because it's comprised of fat. Now, I don't know if that's the answer, but maybe that explains partly why acetyl-carnitine doesn't get into the brain very well, because it's not needed there.
My goodness, yes, that's excellent thinking. Maybe I'll suggest that, Dr. Lindfors and yourself could exchange on that. It'd be amazing. Joan asks, can you take B12 injections daily? How much and for how long?
Oh, I love B12. It's one of my favorite multitasking tools. The problem is it's very poorly absorbed in the gut. And again, this is all compounded because the so-called normal range for vitamin B12 is set so low. In Japan, you're considered deficient if you have a B12 below 500. I saw 2 patients today, both of them had a B12 way below 500. Now, B12 is gloriously safe stuff. As a colleague of mine, Chris Dawkins, commented, who is a GP at Oxford, the only way you could kill yourself with vitamin B12 is to drown in the stuff. Now, of course, we have these normal ranges, which are not normal ranges. They're simply what hospital departments see in people walking into hospital. So they assume that must be normal. But A, people walking into hospital are not normal people. And B, many people are deficient. So the normal reference range is set far too low. A very, very useful test of B12 function is to measure a homocysteine. Now, a fabulous website that you all need to visit is set up by Patrick Holford called Food for the Brain. And on that website, you can get a do-it-yourself homocysteine test that you can do at home yourself. It costs £49.50. Now, that's cheaper than what I can get it done for. And we should all know what our homocysteine is, and it should lie between 5 and 10. Can't remember the units offhand. But for your homocysteine to be normalized, you've got to have normal levels of vitamin B12. And some people have to have it by injection in order to get the level down into reference range. And homocysteine, A, if it's abnormal, it means you're a poor methylator, i.e. you can't heal and repair. And that we know is going to drive cancer, dementia, and heart disease. And secondly, it's directly toxic in its own right. It's directly toxic to the brain and is a major risk factor for dementia. And Patrick has produced the most fabulous website. He's currently collecting patients. You must all join up for that because he's now got over 500,000 people subscribed, and he reckons he'll have 1 million by the end of the year. So it's the largest study in the world looking at the prevention of dementia. And the 3 things that he talks about, which all have to be done in conjunction with each other. 1, low carbohydrate diet. 2, know what your homocysteine is, get it measured. And 3, take fish oils. We're all, we can all do with additional fish oils, or eat oily fish. And the acronym is SMASH. He says smash it. Sardines, mackerel, anchovies, salmon, and herring. All are rich in the essential oils for the brain. And do that, and you won't get dementia.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Quite a few questions on how long patients should spend in the sauna. Is it possible to, I mean, for example, they asked in your study how long they were spending in there. You'd said about 50 times.
Okay, not very long at all. Because most of the chemicals come out in the first few minutes. So, again, many of my patients with fatigue are very intolerant of heat. And that's why they prefer the far infrared, because it just heats up the subcutaneous fat without increasing core temperature. So, 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes would suffice for all. And the important thing is, after you've had your sauna, shower it off. So this is why I like the Epsom salt baths, because most people thankfully have a bath. It's very cheap. You can sit in the bath for maybe 20 minutes, which is more than enough time to mobilize the chemicals out of the subcutaneous fat. And simultaneously, you're washing it off. So you are allowed a bit of soap in your bath, you'll be relieved to hear. And you're also getting yourself a nice dose of magnesium, which we know is very good for muscles, nerves, and mitochondria. And you're also getting a nice dose of sulfate, which A, helps you detox, and B, improves exclusion zone water. So there's so many reasons why Epsom salt baths are so good for us. And of course, that's supported by thousands of years of clinical experience. When the Romans, and the Victorians and the like got sick, they took the waters. And of course, many of these spas, are full of magnesium and sulfate, and they felt better for it. And now we know why. We know what the mechanism was.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Hanela here is saying she can't control her body's temperature due to damage to her hypothalamus. Cold causes hypothermia quickly, and heat causes hyperthermia. And several others are saying they feel the same. Is there a way to manage heat like a sauna for somebody like that?
Okay. Well, I would love to know the mechanism of temperature control, and I'm ashamed to say I don't. I've been looking and looking and looking, and I don't know. And it is a real feature of people with fatigue syndrome that have a very narrow envelope of temperatures within which they feel comfortable. The central heating's got to be just right. The clothes got to be just right. They don't tolerate the cold. They don't tolerate the heat. And and I wish I could give a nice practical this will fix it, answer. And I can't. But once you have improved energy delivery mechanisms, then it becomes much more tolerable because we lose heat. We adjust our heat through our skin. And if we're in a very hot climate, then we increase the blood supply to the skin so that we can sweat and so that we can lose heat by radiation. But of course, the skin is the largest organ in the body. And when you pump blood to the skin, you increase cardiac output by about 20%. And that's a lot. You see, people with fatigue syndromes are in a state of low cardiac output, bordering on heart failure. Why? Because they haven't got the energy for the heart to beat powerfully as a pump. So very often, just at rest, just when they're lying down, their heart's working at its maximum possible potential. And to ask it to work 20% harder, well, it can't do that. And so if you can't dissipate heat by pumping it to the skin, then that's going to be enormously stressful because the core temperature is going to increase, and that's very uncomfortable. And of course, the converse is true. If you are cold, then the way the body normally increases heat is by mitochondria working harder. You pour out thyroid hormones and adrenal hormones to adapt to that. And of course, your body can't do that either. So, I can only explain this in terms of energy delivery mechanisms. You mentioned that she has damage to her hypothalamus, but how do you know that? We talk about this in a very, it's brain. Yeah, but how do we know that? Nobody's going to do a hypothalamic biopsy, are they? That's not a good idea at all. So, I can only think that this has an energy delivery explanation. And work on that and hope that you increase your energy envelope so you're more tolerant of extremes of temperature.
Thank you. Amazing. I hadn't realized, but we've almost overrun by half an hour already.
Oh,
incredible how fast the time has gone. So I'm so sorry about that, everybody who's asked further questions. We've got at least 46, probably going on 50 that I haven't asked yet, Sarah. So I hope that we'll have you back to answer at least all of these questions, though many more will come in then as well. By the way, everybody, all the questions on the thyroid, many of them are answered in your book, aren't they, Sarah? Which is
there are lots there. And also, as you probably all worked out, I'm gobby, I can talk a lot. But what we have a lot of fun doing is I run weekends at my home, and people come on a Thursday night, and we obviously have a paleo ketogenic diet, and we sit in my summer house, which is very comfortable, and I talk all day Friday and Saturday and Sunday, and there's lots of chit chat, and we go in the hot tub, and we go in the sauna chamber, and we do some detoxing, and we have a lot of fun and giggles as well. So if anybody'd like to join me for a weekend, then please do.
Oh, amazing. They're asking how they can contact you. Is that on your website?
Yeah, it's on the website. On the front page, I think there's a little thing that says workshops. So you click on that, it tells you when they are, and then just sign up.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, just to mention that AONM will be having a few further webinars in March, actually. On the 12th of March, which is a Wednesday, we have Dr. Lee Cowden from the States. It's a webinar called Unlocking the Power of Nutrimedics, Harnessing Nature for Better Health. And on the a little bit after that, the 26th of March, we have Dr. Robert Bransfield, amazing psychiatrist from the States, very, very famous in the field of Lyme disease and co-infections, who's talking about the association between infectious diseases, mental impairments, violent behavior, and global instability. So there are a lot of webinars actually coming up. They're on our aonm.org website under upcoming events, so please do register there. And Sarah, your next webinar with us, if we don't have another one on all these questions before then, is on the 7th of October, called The Single Most Important Molecule for Life, How It Impacts on Energy Delivery Mechanisms and Inflammation, with Implications for Management. So again, you can already register for that on the website. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. Absolutely incredible information. Everybody is thanking you for that, for everything that you've given us this evening. And I really don't know how to thank you enough. And we'll be seeing you again very soon, I hope.
Well, thank you, Gillian. You're so active in AONM, and you're so generous with your time as well. So big thanks to you. You're an unsung heroine in my field, I can promise
Thank you.
you.
Well, that's with everybody in the background as well, including Claire, who's done some wonderful, she's answered as many questions as she could this evening as well. And Claire will be saving all the questions on the Q&A and the chat, so we'll have them all for next time. Thank you very, very much, Sarah.
Perfect.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody, for
Gillian,
being
and
there this
goodbye.
evening. Thank you. We will, by the way, be sending out, or at least we'll be making available the slides, because Sarah has kindly said she's going to let us have them. And the recording will be up on the website under past webinars very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.